As a kid, my favorite holiday was Easter. Easter Sunday, because on Easter Sunday, I felt so much joy. The sanctuary was covered with lilies in all colors, and it was just this huge burst of energy. And I felt so alive and so joyful. And the Lutheran Church would sing these huge big hymns on Easter Sunday and have a big procession with all the banners, and it was just this explosion of joy. And then the season following was the season of spring, so much happiness and life and beauty. But there was something about my understanding of Easter that I now realize was a little bit naive. There was something about that movement from the death of Jesus and the cross on Good Friday, one day of grieving on Holy Saturday, and then all of a sudden, Sunday morning, boom, everything is great, and we never have to grieve again. I thought that grief was a one-day thing, metaphorically and literally. I didn't have a lot of experience with grief growing up. I grew up in a very privileged household, and I was also just happened to be lucky that we didn't have any super serious deaths in my family when I was a child. No one that I was close to or saw on a regular basis passed away. We didn't move to a new city. We didn't have anyone diagnosed with a serious illness. I didn't have any friends pass away or have accidents. I just was very privileged, and then also got lucky that I just didn't experience a huge amount of loss in my childhood. When I went to college, like many people, I started dating and I fell in love. And I had a relationship that lasted almost 6 years. And when I was 24, that relationship ended. And at this point, this person was my best friend, was the companion I had through my entire adult life. And I didn't have any experience with how to grieve. I didn't really know what grief felt like. I didn't know what the dynamics of the grief process were. And I didn't know how to make sense of the feelings that I had. I felt sadness, and up until that point, I thought that if I felt a certain kind of way that I didn't like, I should do something about it. I should change my situation. And so in this case, I would try to change the situation. I'd be like, maybe we should get back together, or maybe I did something wrong. But that's not really what grief is. Grief, which I didn't know at the time, of course, does not mean you did something wrong. And of course, it doesn't mean you can necessarily change the situation to make your grief go away. What I did not know at the time was that grief is a process of living. Death is a process of living. This book, Tear Soup, which I only just read recently, has been so eye-opening to me, and I recommend it to anyone who hasn't read it. It's there, you can take a look at it. And in the book, my friend and housemate, Pat Schweibert, writes about how tear soup is a metaphor for the grieving process. She writes about how you might need a different size pot depending on what has happened to you. She writes about how when you don't attend to your grief, the pot boils over and it ends up causing harm and havoc in your relationships and in your soul. She writes about how everybody cooks their tear soup differently. She writes about how no one can cook it for you. She writes about how you need to share your soup with other people, but other people usually can only handle a small amount of someone else's tear soup. She writes about how other people will try to give you advice about how to correctly cook your tear soup, and how that advice really is usually not that helpful. And she writes about how you might need to put some of your soup in the freezer and take it out once in a while on a special anniversary and thaw it out and have a little more of that tear soup once in a while throughout your life. She gives a foundation and a pathway for grieving that I didn't have at that point in my life. She shows how grieving is one of the tasks of tending to our love. How grieving is about love, and how in making that tear soup, we continue to claim life. We continue to claim that love. This poem by Ellen Bass that Pastor Allison, the other Pastor Allison, selected for today is incredibly apt for me, not only because this poem is printed and hanging in the home that I live in, that the author of Tear Soup also lives in, but this poem has a line at the end, this image about holding life like a face between your palms. It sounds like something you're in love with when you hold someone you love between your palms. And this is talking about how this is not a moment where that life, that face is shining with beauty and radiance. This is a moment where this face is plain and difficult and rough around the edges. And you hold that life like a face between your palms. And you say, yes, I will take you. I will love you again. And I love how she switches it from the face of the person you are grieving or the future you had hoped for. She switches it to the face of life itself. It's choosing to love the life that you have, even when it's not necessarily the life that you wanted, even when the outcome isn't necessarily what you wanted. And that definitely happened to me with the outcome of that relationship that I spoke about. I thought I was supposed to control my life and make it be what I wanted it to be. And I've had to let go of that and had to hold on to the life that I do have and choose that life, choose to love that life, and to find things to love about that life, even though it's different than what I had planned. The disciples in our story are in the midst of grief. And what I didn't know as a child when I thought that the grief of the cross happened on one day, on Holy Saturday, what I had not noticed is that the grief lasts through the entire Easter season. So this season that I had thought was about joy and not being sad anymore, I now see more complexly as an adult. I see that these stories of Christ's appearance are not all joy and happiness for the disciples. These stories are painful for them. These stories are confusing. These stories are in the midst of a time where they're processing what has happened. They're grieving it, but they're also starting to taste a different life, and they're confused. Do we embrace this new life? Do we embrace the Jesus that is risen to us now? We're angry and scared and sad that it's not the Jesus who had been with us before, at least not in the same form. We know that Jesus, that same Jesus, is with us, but it's different now. Jesus appears behind locked doors. Jesus isn't recognized and is only made known in the sharing of the meal, the breaking of the bread, or the eating of fish. We only see Jesus in this resurrected state, we being the disciples. We only see Jesus in a slightly different way. I think about being Mary, the mother of Jesus, and thinking, this is great that my son is risen, but it's not the same. This risen form of Christ, this is not the same as having my living, breathing son who, couldn't appear and walk through walls, and there's still grief. It's still different. And I think about Mary and how she must be confused about what to feel. Happy to see her son again, and also conflicted because it's not the same. And of course, Jesus doesn't end up staying on earth in that same way. Jesus ascends to heaven, and we don't have the same exact kind of appearances. So this future, though it is a resurrection and it is bodily and earthy, and Jesus is bearing these wounds and eating and drinking with them, it's still not exactly the same as it was before. And I can imagine, these disciples basically taking Jesus' face in their hands and being like, this is not the same as before, but I'm going to choose to love this new Jesus. I'm going to choose to embrace this new way of being in relationship with Jesus, even while I'm sad that it's not the same as it was before. As we turn to our one-to-ones today, I'd love for you to think about a time or times, or maybe it's right now, when you have cooked some tear soup. And you can share what the circumstance was that, made you choose one of these different sized pots and cook that soup, but you don't have to. But you can think about times when you were grieving, trying to cook that tear soup. Maybe you were like me, not even realizing that that's exactly what you were supposed to be doing. Maybe you were fighting cooking the tear soup because you thought you shouldn't be. Whatever it was, I'm wondering, what have people done or said during that time that got in the way of your process of cooking tear soup? Or what are the things you have said to yourself that I was saying to myself, that I shouldn't feel this way? What are the things that have been said to you from outside yourself or from within your own head, that have gotten in the way in that cooking of tear soup? And what would have been more helpful at that time? What would have been a more helpful way for you and your community to support that making of tear soup that was necessary at that time? You don't have to share in a pair. It's optional, of course. You can also take this time to pray, light a candle. If this service has brought up some emotions for you, you might need to make a little tear soup right now if that's something that you need. Or if you need to use the restroom and step out, that's totally fine too. But if you would like to share with a partner, I invite you to do that now.